The wilderness is vast, unpredictable, and often merciless. Hunters step into it seeking challenge, food, or trophies. But every trip carries risks nature never negotiates. One wrong move, one misjudged shot, or one unexpected predator can flip a calm pursuit into chaos. From a 800-pound Kodiak bear struck down by a shotgun in Alaska to a polar bear stalking sea ice in Nunavut, these stories span raw survival and shocking tragedy. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters where experienced hunters faced nature's fury and barely escaped, or didn't at all. Late August 2018, Kodiak Island, Alaska. The remote wilderness of this massive island, covering over 3,500 square miles of rugged terrain, had witnessed countless encounters between man and beast since Russian fur traders first arrived in the 1760s. Dense spruce forests, steep mountain slopes, and winding salmon streams created a perfect habitat for the world's largest brown bears. The island's isolation, accessible only by boat or plane, meant that any hunting expedition carried inherent risks that could quickly turn deadly. Emmett Cale, a seasoned hunting guide from Anchorage, had been tracking a massive bull moose for 3 days through the thick underbrush along the Karluk River. His weathered hands gripped a 12-gauge Remington 870 Express, loaded with federal premium 00 buck slugs that packed enough punch to drop any creature on the continent. The morning mist clung to the alders like ghostly fingers, and the wet driftwood scattered along the riverbank made every step a calculated risk. Emmett had warned his client about the treacherous footing, but nothing could have prepared either of them for what emerged from the wilderness. The moose trail led them deeper into bear country, where massive paw prints in the muddy soil told stories of creatures that commanded absolute respect. Emmett had guided dozens of hunts on Kodiak Island over the past 15 years, and he knew the signs. Fresh scratches on tree bark 12 feet high, enormous scat deposits, and the musky scent that hung in the air all pointed to the presence of a dominant male bear somewhere nearby. The island houses roughly 3,500 Kodiak bears, and during salmon season they become increasingly aggressive as they prepare for winter hibernation. As they rounded a bend in the river, following tracks that disappeared into a maze of fallen logs and thick vegetation, Emmett spotted movement ahead. The bull moose lay partially concealed behind a massive spruce that had toppled during spring storms. Its antlers, spanning nearly 5 feet, caught the filtered sunlight as flies buzzed around the fresh carcass. Emmett estimated the animal at over 1,400 pounds, a prize that would provide substantial meat for any hunting party. However, something felt wrong about the scene ahead. The silence struck him first. No birds chirped in the canopy above, and even the constant hum of insects had ceased. Emmett raised his hand, signaling his client to stop, and chambered a round in his shotgun. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every fiber of his being screamed danger. The moose carcass appeared fresh, killed within hours, but large chunks of meat had already been torn away with surgical precision that only one predator on the island could achieve. Without warning, the forest exploded into chaos. A colossal Kodiak bear, standing nearly 10 feet tall and weighing approximately 1,800 pounds, erupted from the dense cover behind the moose carcass. Its massive head swung toward them, dark eyes filled with territorial rage, and saliva dripped from jaws that could crush a human skull like an eggshell. The bear's thick brown fur rippled with each powerful movement as it assessed the threat to its claimed prize. Emmett had encountered dozens of bears during his guiding career, but this giant dwarfed anything he had ever seen. The bear dropped to all fours and charged with frightening speed, covering ground faster than seemed possible for such a massive creature. Emmett raised his shotgun and fired at point-blank range, less than 15 yards separating him from certain death. The heavy 00 buck slug smashed into the bear's left shoulder with devastating force, tearing through thick muscle and shattering bone. The impact sent a violent shockwave up Emmett's arms, nearly jarring the weapon from his grip, and the thunderous report echoed off the surrounding mountains. The grizzly roared in pain and fury, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Blood sprayed from the wound, but the massive predator barely slowed its charge. Emmett worked the pump action with practiced speed, ejecting the spent shell and chambering another round. His training kicked in as adrenaline flooded his system. narrowing his focus to the immediate threat bearing down on him. The bear's massive paws churned through mud and debris as it closed the remaining distance. Emmett fired his second shot just as the bear reached the river's edge, only 10 yards away. The slug struck center mass, driving deep into the animal's chest cavity and causing massive internal trauma. The impact drove the beast backward, its hind legs splashing into the shallow water as it fought to maintain balance. Water and debris sprayed in all directions from the bear's thrashing movements, and the recoil from the powerful shotgun nearly knocked Emmett off his feet on the slippery riverbank. The wounded giant staggered, disoriented and bleeding heavily from both wounds. Dark blood stained the water around its feet as it swayed, trying to comprehend the sudden reversal of fortune. For several tense seconds, the bear stood motionless, its intelligent eyes fixed on Emmett with a mixture of pain and confusion. The hunter kept his weapon trained on the massive predator, ready to fire again if necessary, though his hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Gradually, the bear's survival instincts overcame its territorial aggression. It turned away from the confrontation, moving with labored steps toward the dense forest from which it had emerged. Each movement left crimson droplets on the fallen leaves, and the animal's breathing had become labored and irregular. Within moments, the giant had vanished into the thick underbrush, leaving only trampled vegetation and bloodstains as evidence of the violent encounter. Emmett's heart pounded against his ribs as he struggled to process what had just occurred. His client stood frozen 20 yards behind him, face pale with shock at witnessing such raw, primal violence. The entire encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds, but those moments had stretched like hours in Emmett's memory. He realized that the shotgun's devastating power had delivered punishment that even a 800-pound Kodiak bear could neither absorb nor ignore, quite literally saving his life in the span of a few heartbeats. The immediate aftermath brought a sobering awareness of how quickly the Alaskan wilderness could transform from peaceful to deadly. Emmett checked his weapon, ensuring it remained loaded and functional, while scanning the tree line for any sign of the wounded bear's return. The moose carcass that had triggered the confrontation lay abandoned, no longer worth the risk of approaching. They would need to report the encounter to wildlife authorities and arrange for tracking teams to locate the injured bear. As they retreated to their base camp, Emmett reflected on the encounter that had reminded him why Kodiak Island demanded absolute respect from anyone brave enough to hunt its wilderness. The shotgun had performed exactly as designed, delivering stopping power when human life hung in the balance, proving that sometimes raw firepower made the difference between returning home safely and becoming another statistic in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. Late February 2015, northern Minnesota. The pristine wilderness of Lake Vermilion stretched across 40,557 acres of frozen water, its surface appearing solid enough to support heavy vehicles. This massive lake, formed by glacial activity over 10,000 years ago, had been a vital hunting ground for Ojibwe tribes long before European settlers arrived in the 1800s. The area's harsh winters typically created ice thick enough to support entire fishing villages, but recent temperature fluctuations had created dangerous conditions that even experienced locals struggled to predict. Thomas Hayes, a veteran hunting outfitter from Duluth, had been guiding clients across these frozen waters for over 20 years. He understood the lake's moods better than most, reading ice conditions like others read books. His weathered face bore scars from decades of northern exposure, and his steady hands carried a .300 Winchester Magnum that had never failed him during countless hunting expeditions. The rifle's walnut stock showed the wear of constant use, and the Leopold scope had been zeroed perfectly for the flat trajectory shots that frozen lake hunting often demanded. Thomas wore insulated neoprene waders that reached his chest, designed for emergency water entry during ice fishing season. The thick rubber provided crucial insulation against hypothermia, though he hoped never to test its limits. His client, a wealthy businessman from Minneapolis, followed 30 yards behind, struggling with the unfamiliar terrain and clearly out of his element on the treacherous surface. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, masking the visual clues that experienced hunters used to identify dangerous ice conditions. They had been tracking a massive white-tailed deer across the lake for 3 hours, following tracks that led toward a series of small islands near the lake's center. The buck's print suggested an animal well over 200 pounds, with a rack that would easily score in the record books. Thomas estimated they were closing within 120 yards of their quarry when movement ahead caught his attention through the swirling snow. What he initially mistook for their target turned out to be something far more dangerous. A massive bull moose, standing nearly 7 feet at the shoulder and weighing over 1,500 pounds, emerged from behind a cluster of ice-covered boulders. The giant's antlers spanned 6 feet, and steam rose from its nostrils in the frigid air. Thomas immediately recognized the danger such a massive animal posed to the ice beneath their feet. Moose possessed incredible strength but poor judgment regarding ice conditions, often breaking through surfaces that could support much smaller animals. The moose seemed unaware of their presence as it moved toward what appeared to be a feeding area where aquatic plants remained accessible beneath the ice. Thomas watched in horror as the animal's front hooves crashed through a hidden pocket of thin ice, sending shock waves through the surrounding surface. Frigid water erupted around the moose's legs as it struggled to maintain footing on the crumbling edge. The animal's panic created even more stress on the already compromised ice structure. Thomas tried to back away from the unstable area, but his foot slipped on a patch of black ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. He crashed through a weakened section that had been undermined by the moose's thrashing, and icy water surged around his chest with shocking intensity. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and causing immediate muscle spasms. His rifle nearly disappeared into the dark water as he fought to keep his head above the surface. Clinging desperately to the jagged ice edge with numb fingers, Thomas struggled to orient himself in the chaos. The moose continued thrashing nearby, creating waves that threatened to push him under the ice shelf. With tremendous effort, he managed to bring his rifle to bear and fired a single round at the struggling animal. The bullet grazed the moose's shoulder, causing it to rear backward and finally break free from its icy trap before disappearing toward the distant shoreline. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs as hypothermia began setting in with frightening speed. The insulated waders that had seemed like adequate protection now filled with freezing water, threatening to drag him beneath the surface. His client screamed from the safety of thicker ice but could offer no practical assistance without risking his own life. Thomas knew he had perhaps minutes before the cold water incapacitated him completely. Using every ounce of remaining strength, Thomas hauled himself onto a section of ice that appeared more stable, rolling away from the hole that had nearly become his grave. His entire body shook violently as his core temperature dropped, and his fingers had become so numb that operating his rifle would have been impossible. The wet clothing began freezing almost immediately in the sub-zero air temperature, creating an additional layer of danger. The journey back to shore became a nightmare of careful navigation across increasingly unstable ice. Thomas moved on hands and knees, distributing his weight across the largest possible surface area while his client provided verbal guidance from safer positions. Every crack and groan from the ice beneath them served as a reminder of how quickly the situation could deteriorate further. They reached solid ground after what felt like hours but had actually been only 20 minutes. Thomas's hands were so frozen that his client had to help him remove the wet clothing and start a warming fire from their emergency supplies. The experience had transformed a routine hunting expedition into a fight for survival that neither man would ever forget. As sensation slowly returned to his extremities, Thomas realized how fragile the barrier between life and death could be on frozen northern lakes. Even decades of experience meant nothing when nature decided to remind humans of their vulnerability. The incident reinforced his respect for the unpredictable power of Minnesota's wilderness, where one misstep could transform expert hunters into victims of the very environment they thought they had mastered. Late September 2012, the northern plains of North Dakota. The vast grasslands stretched endlessly toward the horizon, broken only by occasional coulees and scattered groves of cottonwood trees. This region had witnessed the near extinction and gradual recovery of American bison since the late 1800s, when massive herds that once numbered in millions had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 animals. The Theodore Roosevelt National Park area, though not their exact location, served as a reminder of conservation efforts that had brought these magnificent creatures back from the brink of disappearance. Caleb Mercer, Jonas Hayes, and Marco Ruiz had traveled from their homes in Colorado for what they believed would be a straightforward bison hunt on private ranch land. The three men had hunted together for over a decade, sharing countless adventures across the American West. Caleb, a construction foreman from Denver, carried his trusted .338 Winchester Magnum that had dropped elk and moose across multiple states. Jonas, a retired police officer, preferred his reliable .30 .06 Springfield that had served him well during 20 years of law enforcement. Marco, the youngest of the group at 35, wielded a .308 Ruger American that he had customized for long-range precision shooting. The September rut had begun, transforming normally docile bison bulls into aggressive, unpredictable animals driven by testosterone and territorial instincts. The hunters had observed several smaller groups throughout the morning, but nothing matching the trophy-class animal they sought. Their guide had warned them about rutting behavior, explaining how bulls became increasingly dangerous as mating season reached its peak. The animal's normally poor eyesight became even more compromised by a single-minded focus on establishing dominance over rivals and claiming females. Late in the afternoon, they spotted their target. A massive bull bison stood alone in a shallow depression, his enormous head lowered as he pawed the dry prairie grass. The animal easily weighed 2,000 pounds, with a shoulder hump that rose nearly 6 feet above the ground. His shaggy brown coat rippled with each movement, and his curved black horns gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Steam rose from his nostrils as he snorted challenges to invisible rivals, completely absorbed in rutting behavior that made him particularly dangerous. Caleb took point as the most experienced long-range shooter among the three hunters. He estimated the distance at 160 yards, well within the effective range of his powerful Magnum cartridge. The wind remained calm, and the bull presented a broadside shot that should have resulted in a quick, clean kill. Marco and Jonas positioned themselves for follow-up shots if necessary, though none of them expected the massive animal to survive a well-placed .338 Winchester Magnum round. Caleb's shot rang across the prairie, echoing off distant hills before fading into the vast silence of the plains. However, instead of dropping the massive bull, the bullet struck too far back, penetrating the animal's flank rather than the vital chest cavity. The wound, though serious, only served to enrage the already aggressive animal rather than incapacitate it. Dark blood stained the bull's side as it spun toward the source of the attack, eyes blazing with fury and pain. The wounded bison pivoted with surprising agility for such a massive creature and began charging toward the hunters with terrifying speed. The ground shook beneath 2 tons of muscle and bone as the bull covered ground faster than any of them had believed possible. Caleb worked his bolt frantically, trying to chamber another round while backing away from the approaching juggernaut. His companions shouted warnings and raised their own rifles, but the bull's charge happened too quickly for coordinated response. Caleb stumbled backward over the uneven prairie terrain, his attention divided between operating his rifle and maintaining his footing. A hidden gopher hole, one of thousands that dotted the grassland, caught his boot at exactly the wrong moment. He fell hard onto his back and his rifle skittered away across the dry grass, leaving him completely defenseless against the charging bull. Jonas and Marco watched in horror as their friend disappeared beneath the massive animal. The bull's hooves struck Caleb repeatedly as the enraged animal trampled him into the prairie soil. The impact of 2,000 pounds moving at full speed created injuries that no human body could survive. Jonas and Marco fired repeatedly at the massive animal, their bullets finding their mark. But the bull's momentum carried it past Caleb's motionless form before it finally collapsed 20 yards away. The entire attack had lasted fewer than 30 seconds, but those moments had transformed their hunting expedition into a tragedy that would haunt the survivors forever. Jonas rushed to his fallen friend while Marco continued watching for any sign of life from the wounded bull. Caleb lay twisted and broken, his chest crushed by the massive hooves that had ended his life instantly. The experienced hunter who had guided them through countless adventures would never return home to his family in Denver. The bison's fury had exacted the ultimate price for a poorly placed shot during the most dangerous time of year. The survivors faced the grim task of explaining how a routine bison hunt had turned deadly in seconds. They realized that even experienced hunters armed with powerful rifles could fall victim to the raw power and unpredictable nature of America's largest land animal, especially during rutting season when normal caution gave way to blind aggression. Late September 2009, Idaho's Bitterroot Mountains. The rugged wilderness area spanning the Idaho-Montana border had served as a crucial habitat for black bears since the last ice age ended over 10,000 years ago. Dense forests of Douglas fir and lodgepole pine covered steep mountain slopes that rose above 9,000 feet, creating perfect conditions for the region's thriving bear population. Native American tribes had hunted these mountains for centuries before Lewis and Clark's expedition passed through the area in 1805. Establishing it as prime territory for both wildlife and the hunters who pursued them. Logan Hayes and his 3 hunting companions had established their remote elk camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering conifers, 15 miles from the nearest Forest Service road. Logan, a mechanical engineer from Boise, carried his grandfather's .30 .06 Winchester Model 70 that had accounted for dozens of elk over 4 decades of hunting. His friends Dave and Rick carried matching .308 Ruger precision rifles they had purchased specifically for this expedition, while Tom preferred his lightweight .270 Winchester for the steep mountain terrain they would be navigating. The group had spent 3 days scouting elk sign without success, but their spirits remained high as they settled around the crackling campfire on their 4th evening. Fresh venison from a deer Tom had taken earlier that day sizzled in a cast iron skillet, filling the mountain air with aromas that carried for miles in the still evening atmosphere. Cooking grease popped and hissed as Logan tended the meal, while his companions organized gear and planned the next day's hunting strategy. None of them realized that the scent of cooking meat had attracted unwanted attention from the surrounding forest. The night seemed perfectly peaceful as elk calls echoed from distant ridges and stars appeared in the clear mountain sky. Their campsite appeared secure, with rifles staged within easy reach and all food properly stored in bear-resistant containers, according to Forest Service regulations. Logan had guided hunting expeditions throughout Idaho for over 15 years, and he understood the importance of maintaining a clean camp in bear country. However, the lingering smell of venison and accumulated cooking odors had created an irresistible attraction for any carnivore within miles of their location. Without warning, a massive black bear erupted from the tree line with explosive violence that shattered the peaceful evening. The animal weighed approximately 400 pounds with powerful shoulders and claws designed for tearing apart logs in search of insects. Its black fur appeared almost invisible in the firelight as it charged directly toward the source of the enticing aromas. Tents collapsed under its weight. Coolers flew through the air, and the bear's thunderous roar echoed off surrounding peaks as it began destroying everything in its path. Logan grabbed his .30 .06 and fired a desperate shot at point-blank range, aiming for the bear's shoulder as it rampaged through their campsite. The 180-grain bullet struck home, penetrating muscle and bone, but the massive predator barely slowed its destructive assault. Blood stained its thick fur as it continued swiping at backpacks, scattering gear across the clearing and searching frantically for the source of the meat smell that had drawn it from the forest. The wounded animal's fury only intensified as pain mixed with its feeding drive. The bear's powerful swipe knocked Logan backward toward the fire pit, where glowing coals threatened to ignite his clothing. He rolled away from the heat just as the massive predator lunged at him again, its claws tearing through his heavy jacket and leaving deep scratches across his back. Logan attempted to work his bolt-action rifle for a second shot, but the mechanism jammed with a spent cartridge case, leaving him completely defenseless against the enraged animal that now focused entirely on him as a threat. His companions scattered in different directions, unable to retrieve their rifles from where they had been staged near the demolished tents. Tom scrambled up a nearby pine tree while Dave and Rick dove behind a large boulder, shouting warnings and throwing rocks at the bear in desperate attempts to distract it from Logan. The bear ignored their efforts, completely focused on the hunter who had wounded it and now represented the primary threat to its feeding opportunity. Logan screamed as he dove behind a massive tree stump, using the solid wood as a shield while the bear clawed furiously at the obstacle. Splinters flew as the animal's claws gouged deep marks in the ancient wood, demonstrating the incredible power contained in its massive paws. The bear's hot breath steamed in the cool mountain air as it tried to reach around the stump, its dark eyes reflecting firelight as it pressed its attack with single-minded determination. After several minutes of frantic destruction, the bear finally began showing effects from its gunshot wound. Blood loss and exhaustion gradually overcame its feeding drive, and the massive predator slowly retreated toward the tree line from which it had emerged. The animal disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a campsite that looked like a tornado had passed through it. Logan emerged from behind the stump, bloodied and shaken, his jacket torn but his life intact. The aftermath revealed the complete destruction of their carefully organized hunting camp. Tents lay in shreds, gear was scattered across hundreds of yards, and their food supplies had been completely contaminated or destroyed. Logan realized that even the most prepared hunters could become victims when a hungry black bear decided to claim their campsite as a feeding opportunity, transforming a peaceful evening into a life-threatening encounter that none of them would ever forget. Late October 2007, southern France. The rolling hills of Provence stretched endlessly beneath a canopy of autumn colors, where centuries-old vineyards produce some of Europe's finest wines. This region had been cultivated since Roman legions first planted grapevines over 2,000 years ago, creating a landscape that perfectly blended agriculture with wilderness. Wild boar populations had exploded throughout France since the 1960s, when hunting restrictions and agricultural changes allowed their numbers to grow from approximately 40,000 to over 1 million animals across the country. Julien Moreau, a wealthy investment banker from Paris, had paid substantial fees for a guided hunting experience on a prestigious wine estate near Aix-en-Provence. The manicured vineyards represented generations of careful cultivation, with each row of Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon vines worth thousands of euros per hectare. Julien carried an expensive .30 .06 Winchester Model 70 fitted with a premium Zeiss 412X scope, equipment that cost more than most hunters spent in a lifetime. His guide had assured him that wild boar hunting in such civilized surroundings would provide excitement without excessive danger. The estate sprawled across 500 hectares of prime vineyard terrain, interspersed with oak groves and limestone cliffs that provided perfect cover for the region's thriving boar population. Harvest season had recently concluded, leaving grape clusters and fallen fruit scattered between the vine rows. This abundance of food attracted boar from miles around, creating ideal hunting conditions while simultaneously making the animals more aggressive as they competed for resources. Morning dew glistened on perfectly maintained trellises that supported vines heavy with their final grape clusters of the season. Julien had been stalking through the vineyard for 2 hours without success when his guide spotted fresh rooting activity near a section planted with premium Merlot grapes. Deep furrows in the soil revealed where a large boar had been searching for grubs and roots, causing thousands of euros in damage to the carefully maintained vineyard floor. The guide estimated the animal's weight at over 250 pounds based on the depth of its tracks and the extent of soil disturbance it had created while feeding. They approached the area cautiously, stepping carefully between vine rows while avoiding loose stones and irrigation ditches that could cause twisted ankles or worse injuries. The guide had warned Julien about the hidden hazards that existed even in such manicured surroundings, where a single misstep could result in serious injury. Wooden stakes and wire supports created additional obstacles that required constant attention, especially when carrying a loaded rifle through terrain designed for agriculture rather than hunting activities. The massive wild boar appeared without warning from behind a section of century-old Merlot vines, its tusks gleaming wickedly in the filtered sunlight. The animal's coarse black hair bristled with aggression as it assessed the threat posed by the 2 humans who had disturbed its feeding. Julien raised his rifle and fired what he believed would be a killing shot at the animal's shoulder, but his excitement caused him to rush the shot. The bullet grazed the boar's thick hide, creating a superficial wound that only served to enrage the already aggressive animal. The wounded boar charged with frightening speed, its powerful legs churning through the soft soil between vine rows. Wooden trellises splintered and collapsed as the 250-pound animal smashed through the carefully maintained vineyard infrastructure. Wicker harvest baskets were scattered in all directions while the boar's sharp hooves tore up irrigation lines that had taken years to install properly. Julian attempted to leap over a fallen vine post, but his expensive hunting boots slipped on the dew-covered wood. The boar's razor-sharp tusk caught Julian's left thigh as he fell, tearing through his designer hunting pants and gouging deep furrows in his leg. Pain shot through his body as blood soaked his clothing, and he realized that even his expensive gear did not protect against the primitive fury of an enraged wild animal. The boar knocked him to the ground among the vine roots, and for several terrifying moments, Julian found himself completely at the mercy of an animal that possessed both the power and inclination to kill him. Rolling desperately away from the attacking boar, Julian managed to bring his rifle to bear despite the searing pain in his leg. His second shot struck the animal's center mass, the heavy bullet penetrating vital organs and finally stopping the creature's assault. Dark blood stained the pristine soil between the vine rows as the boar staggered, confusion replacing fury in its small eyes. The massive animal took several more steps before collapsing among the grapevines it had been defending moments earlier. The guide rushed to Julian's aid, applying pressure to the deep gashes in his thigh while calling for emergency medical assistance on his satellite phone. Blood loss had weakened Julian considerably, but the wounds, though serious, had missed major arteries that could have proven fatal. The expensive hunting expedition had become a medical emergency that required immediate evacuation to the nearest hospital in Aix-en-Provence, where surgeons would spend hours repairing the damage inflicted by the boar's tusks. As paramedics loaded him into a helicopter for transport to the trauma center, Julian reflected on how quickly his luxurious hunting experience had turned into a fight for survival. The manicured vineyard that had seemed so civilized and safe had proven to be just as dangerous as any wilderness when wild animals defended their territory. His expensive equipment and prestigious surroundings had not protected the raw power of nature that still lurked beneath the surface of even the most cultivated landscapes. The incident served as a reminder that wild boars remain dangerous predators regardless of their surroundings, capable of transforming any environment into a battlefield where human civilization counted for nothing against millions of years of evolutionary adaptation. Even in the heart of French wine country, where tourism and agriculture had tamed the landscape for centuries, primitive forces could still emerge to challenge anyone foolish enough to underestimate their power. Late March 2011, northern Nunavut, Canada. The vast expanse of sea ice stretched endlessly toward the horizon, broken only by pressure ridges that rose like frozen mountain ranges against the Arctic sky. This region, inhabited by Inuit peoples for over 4,000 years, represented one of Earth's most challenging environments, where temperatures routinely dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Climate change had begun affecting ice formation patterns, creating unpredictable conditions that challenged even the most experienced hunters who had spent their entire lives reading the subtle signs of safe versus dangerous ice. Aput Siku, a traditional Inuit hunter from the remote community of Grise Fjord, had been tracking across the sea ice for 6 hours in search of seal breathing holes and whale carcasses that provided essential protein for his extended family. At 45 years old, he possessed knowledge passed down through generations of Arctic survival, understanding ice conditions and weather patterns that meant the difference between life and death in this unforgiving environment. His .375 H&H Magnum, purchased through government subsistence programs, represented modern technology adapted for traditional hunting practices. The rifle's heavy caliber was specifically chosen for its ability to stop polar bears, the apex predators that ruled this frozen domain. Aput had encountered bears numerous times during his hunting career, but recent years had brought more frequent and aggressive encounters, as changing ice conditions forced bears to travel greater distances in search of food. His traditional parka, made from caribou hide and sealed with waterproof materials, provided crucial insulation against winds that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, masking the visual cues that experienced hunters used to identify pressure ridges, thin ice, and open leads of water that could appear without warning. Aput moved carefully across the uncertain terrain, using a traditional ice pick to test questionable areas while following the scent of a walrus carcass that had been reported by other hunters from his community. The carcass represented weeks of food for multiple families, making the dangerous journey worthwhile despite the risks involved. Arctic wind shredded any exposed skin as Aput approached what appeared to be the feeding site, where dark stains on the snow indicated that scavengers had already discovered the prize. Ravens circled overhead, their black forms stark against the white landscape, while fox tracks crisscrossed the snow around the carcass. However, the most dangerous scavenger in the Arctic was nowhere to be seen, though fresh tracks in the snow indicated that a massive polar bear had claimed the area as its feeding territory within the past few hours. Without warning, a colossal polar bear materialized from behind a pressure ridge, its cream-colored fur providing perfect camouflage against the ice and snow. The massive predator weighed approximately 1,500 pounds and stood nearly 10 feet tall when it reared onto its hind legs to assess the threat posed by the human intruder. Steam rose from its black nostrils as it tested the air, and its dark eyes fixed on Aput with the calculating intelligence of an apex predator that had never learned to fear humans. Aput raised his powerful rifle and fired immediately, understanding that hesitation meant certain death when confronting a polar bear on its home territory. The heavy .375 H&H Magnum slug struck the bear's shoulder with tremendous force, penetrating thick fur and muscle before shattering bone. However, the massive predator barely faltered, its incredible size and determination allowing it to absorb punishment that would have dropped any other animal. Dark blood stained its fur as the wounded giant began closing the distance between them. The bear's charge caused the ice beneath Aput's snowshoes to crack ominously as 1,500 pounds of muscle and fury approached at frightening speed. The impact of the massive animal's paws created stress fractures that spread across the surface like a spider web, undermining the stability of ice that had appeared solid moments earlier. Aput felt the surface give way beneath his feet as he slid toward an open lead of black water that could kill him within minutes through hypothermia. Desperate to avoid the freezing water, Aput crawled across increasingly unstable ice while the polar bear continued its assault. The predator's claws scraped against the ice as it struggled to maintain footing on the same unstable surface that threatened to dump both hunter and prey into the deadly Arctic Ocean. Aput managed to chamber another round despite his precarious position and fired his second shot into the bear's chest as shards of ice sprayed around them from the animal's thrashing movements. The bear staggered, finally showing effects from its wounds as blood loss began affecting its coordination and strength. Confusion replaced aggression in its dark eyes as it realized that the ice beneath them posed as much danger as the human it had been attacking. The massive predator backed away from the cracking floe, seeking more stable ice deeper in the pressure ridge system where its weight would be better supported by thicker, more solid formations. Aput found himself soaked with freezing seawater and gasping for breath as he hauled himself onto more stable ice using his rifle as a lever. His traditional clothing had absorbed enough water to create immediate danger from hypothermia, and his extremities were already beginning to lose feeling despite the insulated materials. The bear had disappeared into the maze of pressure ridges, leaving behind only blood droplets on the snow to mark its passage through the encounter. The journey back to his snowmobile became a race against time as Aput's body temperature dropped and his movements became increasingly uncoordinated. He understood that survival in the Arctic required immediate action when clothing became compromised, and he began stripping off wet layers while his engine warmed up. Emergency survival gear cached on his machine provided dry clothing and chemical heating pads that would help restore core body temperature during the long ride home. As sensation slowly returned to his frozen hands and feet, Aput reflected on how quickly the Arctic environment could transform from familiar hunting ground to deadly trap. The encounter had reminded him that even experienced hunters armed with powerful rifles remained vulnerable to the combined threats of polar bears and unstable ice conditions that characterized life in the far north. Traditional knowledge and modern equipment meant nothing when nature decided to test human limits in the planet's most unforgiving environment. The incident reinforced his respect for polar bears as the Arctic's ultimate predator, animals perfectly adapted to an environment that challenged every aspect of human survival. In the land where ice and death walked hand in hand, Only the most prepared and experienced hunters could hope to return home safely from encounters that tested the very limits of human endurance and survival skills.